What if a glamorous royal gala, designed to celebrate unity, suddenly became the stage for a revelation nobody had prepared for? What if the most important words of the night did not come from the king, but from a man carrying decades of family history? And what if a document connected to Princess Diana suddenly threatened to change the entire mood of the room? That is where this extraordinary story begins. The evening was supposed to be elegant, predictable, and carefully controlled. Guests had arrived expecting the familiar rhythm of a major royal occasion. Formal greetings, expensive gowns, carefully chosen jewelry, cameras positioned to capture every significant expression, and speeches designed to reinforce an image of stability. Queen Camilla appeared to be at the center of that carefully constructed atmosphere. Everything suggested confidence, and that the difficult chapters of the past had finally been placed where royal institutions prefer them to be, safely behind the present. But beneath that polished surface, another story was developing, and almost nobody in the room appeared to know how close the evening was to becoming something entirely different. For weeks, attention had been building around Princess Diana's personal legacy. Reports had suggested that remaining material connected to Diana's private life could finally become part of a broader arrangement involving her family and the royal establishment. To an ordinary observer, it sounded like a story about reconciliation, a chapter closing, a family finding a way to move forward. But there was another possibility. Perhaps the most important decisions had already been made long before anyone stepped into the gala hall. That possibility leads back to a period almost 30 years earlier. The year was 1996. Princess Diana's marriage to then Prince Charles was reaching its formal conclusion, and the world was watching almost every development. Public attention naturally focused on the obvious questions: titles, royal status, public appearances, the future relationship between Diana and the institution she had once joined through marriage. Yet, according to the storyline surrounding this dramatic account, another issue was being considered quietly in the background. It concerned something much less glamorous than crowns or palaces: Diana's private papers, her correspondence, her writings, her personal records, the pieces of her life that could eventually become part of the historical record. At the time, those documents might not have seemed as powerful as they would become decades later. But personal papers have a strange ability to outlive the people who create them. A speech disappears, a television interview becomes archival footage, a newspaper headline becomes yesterday's news, but handwritten thoughts can remain. They can sit untouched for years and suddenly become relevant again. That was precisely what made Diana's private material so significant in this story. The central question was never simply who possessed a collection of papers. The deeper question was this: who would eventually have the power to determine how Diana's private voice was preserved? And perhaps even more importantly, who would decide which parts of that voice future generations would hear? That question reportedly mattered deeply to Diana. According to the account, she understood that history could be rewritten without physically destroying a single document. All it would take would be selective presentation. One story emphasized over another, one memory highlighted while another disappeared, a complicated human being gradually transformed into a carefully polished public symbol. Diana had already experienced how powerful that process could be while she was alive. After her death in 1997, it became even more important. Her brother, Charles Spencer, would remain one of the people closest to the family history surrounding her, and that connection would eventually place him at the center of a controversy that seemed impossible to predict. For years, the public had become accustomed to seeing Diana's story through familiar images: the young princess, the humanitarian, the fashion icon; the mother, the woman whose life became one of the most closely followed stories of the 20th century. But there was another Diana, a private woman who wrote, remembered, questioned, worried, hoped, and struggled away from the cameras. That version could not be captured by a photograph. It existed in words, and words have consequences. That is why the reported developments surrounding the gala were so significant. Because while everyone else appeared focused on the event itself, Charles Spencer was allegedly carrying something far more important than a prepared speech: the possibility of reopening a story that many believed had already been settled. As guests entered the venue, there was little visible indication that anything unusual was about to happen. The surroundings were immaculate. Flowers had been arranged with precision. Among the decorations were white lilies, flowers strongly associated with Diana in the public imagination, a symbolism impossible to miss. The evening appeared to be about remembrance, unity, and moving forward. Camilla sat among distinguished guests, surrounded by people accustomed to royal protocol. Every gesture was restrained, every smile appeared carefully measured, every camera angle seemed designed to capture harmony. But there was a problem with carefully controlled occasions. They depended on everyone following the expected script, and Charles Spencer was about to become the person nobody could easily predict. Behind the scenes, the account claims that months of private preparation had been taking place. Legal questions were being examined, documents were being reviewed, possible arrangements involving Diana's personal archive were being considered. The idea of a protected trust became central to the story. To most people, the phrase would sound dry and technical, but its implications could be enormous. A trust can determine how property is managed, who has authority over it, and what happens to it in the future. In the context of historical archives, that can mean something even more powerful. It can determine who controls access to the story. That was where the supposed disagreement became much more complicated. If Diana's personal material remained under the influence of the royal establishment, the institution would have a significant role in how her legacy was presented. But if those materials were placed beyond direct palace control, the balance could shift dramatically, and that was the possibility reportedly being explored. The most surprising element was the claim that the preparations had been kept extremely quiet, even from people who normally would have been expected to know. The reason was obvious. The moment such a plan became public, pressure and sides would follow. And once the story entered the media cycle, controlling the narrative would become almost impossible. So secrecy became essential. And then came the gala. The timing could hardly have been more dramatic. The evening had all the ingredients of a perfect royal presentation: a glamorous venue, high-profile guests, international attention, a monarch and queen consort surrounded by influential figures, and a subject that naturally encouraged sentimental reflections about family, history, and continuity. But beneath those themes was the unresolved question of Diana's legacy. For Camilla, the subject was particularly sensitive because the history of Charles, Diana, and Camilla had been intertwined in the public imagination for decades. By this point, the monarchy had spent years moving toward a different chapter. Camilla had become queen consort and later queen, and the institution had gradually sought to present her not as a figure defined by old controversies, but as a working member of the royal family with her own public role. That transformation had taken time, patience, and depended heavily on the past becoming less dominant. But Diana's story had never completely disappeared. It remained embedded in public memory. Every anniversary brought it back. Every documentary reopened old questions. Every new revelation could shift perceptions. That meant any major development involving Diana's private writings had the potential to create a new wave of attention. And Charles Spencer understood that better than almost anyone. Then came the moment that supposedly changed the entire evening. Charles Spencer approached the podium. The room settled. Guests turned toward him. The expectation was simple. He would deliver the kind of speech normally associated with a formal gala, polished, respectful, predictable. But instead of simply following the expected script, the account claims that something unusual happened. The prepared presentation was suddenly no longer the focus. A document appeared, and that document reportedly carried a legal significance that immediately changed the atmosphere. At first, many guests did not understand what they were looking at. Why would a formal royal speech suddenly involve legal paperwork? Why bring a document into an evening built around ceremony? And why would Charles Spencer choose that particular moment to present it? The questions began circulating before the answers arrived. Then came the detail that allegedly caught Camilla's attention. The document was connected to the management and protection of Diana's personal legacy. If the account was accurate, this was not merely another announcement. It represented a decision that had already moved beyond the stage of discussion. That distinction mattered. A proposal can be debated, a suggestion can be rejected, a negotiation can continue, but a legal decision that has already been formalized is something else entirely. It changes the conversation from what might happen to what can anyone do about what has already happened. That was the moment the mood reportedly shifted. Charles Spencer did not need to raise his voice or attack anyone personally. The power of the moment came from what he was apparently revealing. His message centered on memory, on the danger of allowing historical figures to become simplified versions of themselves, and on the responsibility of protecting a person's own words. Then he brought the subject back to Diana, Not the princess, not the global celebrity, not the woman whose photographs had appeared on magazine covers around the world. He spoke about Diana as a sister, a mother, and a private human being whose thoughts existed beyond the public image. That distinction gave the speech its emotional weight, because the audience already knew the public Diana. What they had not necessarily seen was the woman behind the public narrative. And according to the story, Charles Spencer was suggesting that her own words could finally speak for themselves. That possibility was enough to change the atmosphere. But the biggest revelation had not yet been delivered. What exactly was being done with Diana's private material, and who would ultimately have authority over it? The answer, according to the account, involved a trust designed to separate the archive from direct royal control. And that is where the story became even more explosive, because if Diana's papers were genuinely protected in such a structure, the consequences would extend far beyond one gala, affecting historians, biographers, journalists, family members, and potentially millions of people interested in understanding Diana's life from her own perspective. The evening was no longer simply a celebration. It had become a confrontation between memory and control, between an institution's version of history and a family's desire to preserve something more personal. Then came the detail that reportedly stunned the room. The archive was allegedly not going to remain locked away indefinitely. Instead, the material could eventually become accessible. That possibility transformed everything. For years, the public had relied on interviews, biographies, documentaries, recollections from friends, and official accounts to understand Diana. But what if her own private words became available? What if the woman herself could finally speak through the pages she left behind? And what if those words contained observations that challenged assumptions people had carried for decades? That was the question hanging over the gala, and it was about to become even more uncomfortable because the story did not stop with Charles Spencer. Prince William was reportedly involved as well. His presence added another layer to the situation. William had been only 15 when his mother died. He grew up carrying one of the most recognizable family tragedies in modern history, while simultaneously preparing for a future few children could imagine. His relationship with Diana's memory was therefore not simply historical, it was personal. For him, preserving her legacy would have consequences that extended into the next generation of the monarchy. That made the reported decision particularly significant. If William supported a plan to preserve Diana's private writings outside direct palace influence, it could signal a very different philosophy about royal history, one based less on institutional control and more on personal testimony. But the question remained, would the royal establishment accept that? And what would happen if the answer was no? The audience did not have to wait long. As the speech continued, the tension reportedly became impossible to ignore. People who had entered the gala expecting polite entertainment were now listening to something far more serious. The past was no longer being remembered from a safe distance, it was being placed directly in front of them. And Camilla, sitting only a short distance away, was reportedly watching every moment. There was no obvious confrontation, no shouting, no dramatic accusation. But sometimes silence can create more tension than an argument. The room appeared to understand that something important was happening. And Charles Spencer had not finished, because the document was only the beginning. The real question was what it contained, and once that information began to emerge, the gala would never again look like the harmless celebration everyone expected when they first walked through the doors. The most extraordinary part of the story was still waiting, and it centered on words that had allegedly remained private for almost 3 decades, words attributed to Diana herself. If those pages truly existed in the form described, they could provide a glimpse into a woman whose life has been interpreted by millions. But there was an even more intriguing question. Had Diana herself ever anticipated that one day her private writings might become the key to protecting her story? That question would soon take the narrative in an entirely different direction. Because according to the account, there was an old warning, a concern expressed years earlier, and when that warning was placed beside the events of the gala, the coincidence was impossible for observers to ignore. The night had started with flowers, formal clothing, polite smiles and speeches. It was ending with legal documents, family history, and unanswered questions. And Charles Spencer had ensured that everyone was listening. But what happened next would bring Prince William directly into the center of the storm. The events had already changed the evening, but the biggest remaining question was what Prince William knew about the plan, and why his involvement made the situation far more significant than a speech at a gala. According to the account, William was not simply watching events unfold. He had allegedly been aware of preparations taking place long before the gala began, which gave new meaning to his usual reticence. For years, William has generally been careful when speaking about his mother, remembering her publicly but rarely turning her memory into spectacle, which made the reported events even more striking. If William really supported the plan, it would suggest a different philosophy about how Diana's legacy should be preserved, shifting emphasis away from official accounts and toward Diana's own words. That raised an uncomfortable question. What if those words did not fit neatly into the version of history people had become accustomed to? Diana's marriage, her relationship with the royal establishment, and her experience with the media were all complicated, which is precisely why releasing her private writings carried so much emotional weight. The public already knew the famous Diana, princess, humanitarian mother icon, but there was another Diana who existed away from the cameras, and according to the story, that was exactly what Charles Spencer wanted to protect. Not just remembrance, but the question of whether Diana had ever truly been allowed to tell her own story. That question would have been uncomfortable for the royal establishment, since Camilla had spent decades living alongside a history that predated her, and the monarchy had worked hard to move Diana's presence into the background, even as anniversaries and documentaries kept pulling it back. The possibility described in the account was bigger than another documentary. It involved primary material, Diana's own words, and personal documents create a different kind of debate than a biography or commentary, since their existence itself becomes part of the historical record. That is why the reported trust mattered. If the archive had genuinely been placed in an independent legal structure, the royal family would not necessarily control how it was interpreted, and once information enters public conversation, it becomes difficult to control where it goes. Then came the reported lifting of the embargo. Suddenly, material that had supposedly remained restricted for years could become accessible. Journalists began examining the documents. The atmosphere reportedly changed from curiosity to disbelief. People who had spent years covering the royal family were now confronted with the possibility of reading Diana's private thoughts directly. The story describes the reaction as deeply emotional. One journalist was reportedly overwhelmed after reading a passage. Whether every detail of that reaction can be independently established is another matter, but within the account, the moment demonstrates the emotional force of Diana's alleged writings. The room was no longer simply listening to Charles Spencer. It was waiting to hear Diana. That was the real power of the story. For decades, Diana's life had been interpreted through other people's voices. Friends remembered her, journalists investigated her, biographers reconstructed her life, royal commentators analysed her decisions. But her own private words offered something different. They removed at least one layer between the woman and the audience. And that possibility created a new problem for anyone hoping to keep the past neatly contained. Once historical material becomes public, interpretations multiply. One person sees confirmation, another sees missing context, someone else discovers a contradiction. Researchers compare the material with existing records. The conversation grows. That is why the alleged release of Diana's papers would have been so consequential. The palace could respond to one headline, issue a statement, explain a particular claim, but it could not easily control every interpretation of every document. The story would belong to the public. And that is perhaps the most powerful aspect of Charles Spencer's alleged strategy. He would not need to control the conversation forever. He would simply need to open the door. After that, historians, journalists, researchers, and royal watchers would take over. Attention then shifted toward King Charles, who was reportedly following the unfolding situation closely. Again, the most dramatic part was not an open confrontation, but the possibility that the royal family was losing control over a narrative it had spent decades navigating, an uncomfortable position for an institution built around continuity and managed transitions. Diana's legacy has always occupied an unusual place within that system, part of the royal family, yet one of its most complicated figures, deeply connected to the institution while her public identity extended far beyond it. That made her story difficult to contain, and perhaps that was why the reported revelations felt so explosive. The past was no longer being discussed from a safe distance. William's role added another emotional dimension. He was only 15 when Diana died, and unlike historians or journalists, he did not simply inherit her story, he inherited her absence, growing up carrying his mother's memory while preparing for a future few children could imagine. That meant any decision about her private writings would affect how her own son understood and preserved her memory, making the reported decision deeply personal, not simply about documents, but about a son deciding how his mother's voice should survive. The idea was simple. Diana's memory should not belong entirely to an institution but should remain connected to her family and ultimately to history itself. If her writings became available, people might compare them with the stories already accepted as fact, some accounts reinforced, others questioned or complicated. The goal would not be to prove every old allegation, but to let Diana's own perspective enter the discussion. The gala had been designed to demonstrate stability. Instead, it reportedly became a reminder that history cannot always be controlled. The event had been designed around unity, yet the most important discussion concerned an unresolved family history. The cameras were there for celebration. Instead, they captured a moment of uncertainty. And Charles Spencer had created that shift simply by putting Diana's legacy back at the center of the room. There was no need for a shouting match or personal attacks. The tension came from the question itself: who owns a person's story after they are gone, the institution they once belonged to, their family, historians, the media, or their own words? That question reaches far beyond the royal family. Every famous person eventually faces it, and the public's, historians, the media's, and family's interests do not always point in the same direction. Diana's case is particularly powerful because her life was already one of the most documented stories of the modern era, down to her clothes, relationships, and expressions becoming headlines. Yet her thoughts, letters, fears, and memories remained private. According to the account, that was exactly what made the reported archive so important. It represented the possibility of Diana speaking for herself. That is also why Camilla's alleged reaction became such a focus of attention. A shock less about a personal attack than about realizing that a chapter of history she believed was settled had returned in an entirely new form. There is a difference between hearing someone discuss the past and seeing original documents from it. One is interpretation, the other evidence. The event was supposed to represent unity, yet the discussion had become about unresolved history. It was supposed to follow a prepared script, yet Charles Spencer had reportedly changed the conversation completely. But perhaps the most important consequence would not come from anything said that night, but from what happened afterward: historians revisiting old events, researchers comparing private material with public records, journalists investigating disputed claims. That means the gala might not represent an ending, but the beginning of another chapter. And that brings the story back to Charles Spencer. His alleged message was not simply about remembering his sister, it was about who gets to define her. That distinction is crucial because Diana's legacy has never belonged to one person. It has been shaped by her family, the monarchy, the media, historians, and millions of people who remember her in different ways. But the possibility of hearing her private voice introduces something different. It gives Diana herself a place in the conversation. And perhaps that is why the alleged speech carried such emotional force. For Charles Spencer, Diana was his sister. For William, she was his mother. For millions around the world, she remains one of the most recognizable figures of the modern royal era. Those three perspectives can never be completely separated. They are all part of the same history. And when they collide, even a carefully managed royal occasion can suddenly become unpredictable. The gala eventually had to end. Guests left, the cameras moved on, and the lights faded, but the questions remained. What did Diana really think about the final years of her life? What would she have wanted the public to know? And if her private writings ever became widely available, would they change how people remember her? Those questions may never have complete answers, but they explain why Diana's story continues to generate fascination nearly 3 decades after her death. Her legacy remains powerful because it was never completely resolved, and now, according to this dramatic narrative, there may also be another voice entering the discussion: Diana's own. That is the real twist. The most explosive part of the evening may not have been the speech itself, but the possibility that it opened a door that cannot easily be closed again, leading back to documents that have remained out of public view, and to a woman whose story has been told by almost everyone except herself. Whether every dramatic detail surrounding this account is eventually confirmed would require independent evidence, but the underlying fascination is undeniable. Princess Diana's legacy still matters. Her children continue to carry her memory, and Charles Spencer remains one of the people most closely connected to the family history surrounding her. Perhaps the biggest question is therefore not whether Camilla was truly stunned, but what happens if the next document emerges. The answers could create new questions that continue for years, because once people begin wondering whether they have been given the complete story, it becomes difficult to make them stop looking. The royal gala may have lasted only one evening, but the debate surrounding Diana's legacy could last much longer. A gala intended to celebrate the present reportedly became consumed by the past, and a woman who died decades ago once again became the most important person in the room, not because she was physically there, but because everyone was suddenly talking about her. She does not need to be present to dominate the conversation. Her photographs, her charitable legacy, and her family's memory of her remain. And if the claims surrounding her private writings prove accurate, her own words may still have more to say. So the real question remains, was Charles Spencer's reported speech simply a tribute to his sister, or the opening move in a larger effort to reclaim Diana's story? And if more of those private pages ever reach the public, what will they reveal? For now, those questions remain unanswered. But one thing is certain, the story of Princess Diana has never truly ended. If this royal story kept you listening, share your thoughts below. Was Charles Spencer right to put Diana's private legacy back at the center of attention? Would you want to read Diana's own writings if they were ever officially released? And do you think the public would see the royal family's history differently if more primary documents became available? The debate is far from over, and the next revelation could change everything.